My husband's funeral. His mistress spat on my old coat. She said, "He left you penniless because you look like trash." The lawyer smirked. I stood up, adjusted my pantsuit, gave him a document, and said, "Darling, since you're too stupid to notice, let me spell to you. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." I never imagined that my husband's funeral would become the stage for my greatest humiliation. But as I stood there in my old gray coat, watching Mazin parade around in her designer black dress like she owned the place, I realized that even in death, Carlton had found a way to wound me one last time. The Eternal Peace Funeral Home smelled of lilacs and disappointment. White flowers lined the walls, their sickeningly sweet fragrance mixing with the hushed whispers of mourners who had come more out of curiosity than respect. Carlton had been 60 years old when his heart gave out, and judging by the attendance, he hadn't made many genuine friends during his lifetime. I sat in the front row, my hands folded in my lap, staring at the mahogany casket that held the man I'd shared 30 years of my life with. 30 years of lies, as it turned out, but I wasn't ready to think about that yet. Not here. Not now. Look at her, sitting there like the grieving widow. I heard Mazin's voice cut through the somber atmosphere like a blade. She was standing near the back with a group of Carlton's business associates, her voice just loud enough for me to hear but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. I kept my eyes forward, my jaw clenched. At 64, I'd learned to pick my battles, and a funeral wasn't the place for confrontation. Or so I thought. "Honestly, I don't know how Carlton stood it all these years," Mazin continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "Living with someone so plain, so ordinary." My fingers tightened around the worn leather of my purse. Inside, nestled between old receipts and a tube of lipstick, was a manila envelope that no one knew existed. Not yet. The service dragged on with the usual platitudes. The pastor, who barely knew Carlton, spoke about his devotion to family and successful business ventures. If only he knew the truth about either of those things. When it finally ended, people began to filter out slowly. Some approached me with their condolences, their words as empty as their sympathy. "He was a good man," they'd say. Or, "You must be devastated." I nodded and smiled weakly, playing the part I'd perfected over 3 decades of marriage. That's when Mazin made her move. She approached me as I was gathering my things, her heels clicking against the polished floor with predatory precision. At 40, she was everything I wasn't anymore: young, beautiful, and utterly ruthless. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect waves, her makeup flawless despite the tears she'd shed during the service. Crocodile tears, I was certain. "Joelle," she said, my name rolling off her tongue like something distasteful. "I suppose we should talk." I looked up at her, noting how her black Chanel dress probably cost more than most people made in a month. Carlton had always been generous with his girlfriends, even when he could barely afford it. "I don't believe we have anything to discuss, Mazin," I replied, my voice steady despite the tremor I felt in my chest. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, but we do. You see, Carlton left very specific instructions about his estate. He wanted to make sure you were taken care of." The way she emphasized those last words made my skin crawl. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a folded paper, waving it in front of my face like a trophy. "This is a copy of his will," she said, her smile widening. "I think you'll find it very enlightening." I didn't take the paper. Instead, I stood up slowly, my old joints protesting the movement. At my age, everything hurt a little more, lasted a little longer. But dignity, that was something I could still control. "I've already spoken with Mr. Henderson," I said, referring to Carlton's lawyer. "I'm well aware of the contents of my husband's will." Mazin's smile faltered for just a moment before returning full force. "Then you know he left you practically nothing. This house you've been living in, It's going to be sold to pay off his debts. The car? Gone. Even his life insurance policy has me as the beneficiary. She stepped closer, so close I could smell her expensive perfume mixed with the underlying scent of triumph. He told me you never really contributed to the marriage anyway. Never worked, never earned your keep. Just lived off his success like a… what did he call you? A parasite. The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. Around us, a few remaining mourners had stopped their conversations to watch our exchange. I could feel their eyes on us, hungry for drama even at a funeral. Carlton said you'd probably end up in some government housing, Mason continued, her voice getting louder, more theatrical. Living off Social Security and food stamps. He felt sorry for you, really, but not sorry enough to leave you anything substantial. She paused, looking me up and down with obvious disgust. I mean, just look at you. That coat has to be 20 years old. Those shoes are practically falling apart. No wonder Carlton looked elsewhere for companionship. That's when she did it. Without warning, she leaned forward and spat directly onto my coat, the saliva landing on the gray wool with a small wet sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. He left you penniless because you look like trash, she declared, loud enough for everyone remaining in the room to hear. At least now you can dress the part too. The funeral home fell completely silent. I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic outside, my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Several people had pulled out their phones, probably recording this humiliation for social media. Mr. Henderson, Carlton's lawyer, had been standing near the guest book. He was a thin man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and the kind of practiced smile that lawyers perfected over years of delivering bad news. When Mazine spat on me, his smile had widened into something genuinely amused. Well, he said, walking over with his briefcase in hand, I think that covers everything we need to discuss here. Mason, we can meet tomorrow to finalize the transfer of assets. I looked down at my coat, at the wet spot that was slowly spreading across the wool. For a moment, I felt exactly as small and powerless as they wanted me to feel. 64 years old, widowed, and apparently destitute. The perfect victim for their cruelty. But then I remembered the envelope in my purse. I reached into my bag slowly, deliberately, and pulled out the manila envelope I'd been carrying. It was thick, heavy with documents that Mason and Mr. Henderson couldn't possibly imagine existed. Before you start celebrating, I said, my voice calm and clear, there's something you both need to see. I walked over to Mr. Henderson and placed the envelope directly into his hands. His smug expression faltered as he felt the weight of it. Open it, I said simply. He glanced at Mason, who was watching with growing unease, then broke the seal on the envelope. As he pulled out the documents inside, his face went through a series of expressions, confusion, then surprise, then something that looked remarkably like fear. This can't be right, he stammered, his hands shaking slightly as he shuffled through the papers. What is it? Mason demanded, snatching some of the documents from his hands. Her perfectly manicured fingers trembled as she read, her face growing paler with each passing second. I straightened my shoulders and adjusted my coat, wiping away the spit with a tissue from my purse. The wet spot was still there, but somehow it didn't seem to matter anymore. Darling, I said to Mazine, my voice carrying a tone I hadn't used in years, one of absolute authority. Since you're too stupid to notice, let me spell it out for you. I paused, looking around at the remaining mourners who were hanging on every word. This funeral isn't the end of Carlton's story. It's just the beginning of mine. Mazine's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, the documents falling from her nerveless fingers to scatter across the funeral home floor. Mr. Henderson looked like he might faint, but I simply picked up my purse, nodded politely to the few people still watching, and walked toward the exit with my head held high. The real show was just about to begin. The drive home from the funeral gave me time to think. something I'd been avoiding for the past week since Carlton's death. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my old Honda Civic, a car that Mason would probably sneer at, as memories flooded back like a dam bursting open. It was 18 years ago when I first discovered Carlton's infidelity. Not with Mason, she came much later, but with his secretary, a young woman named Rebecca who wore too much perfume and laughed too loudly at his jokes. I remember that day so clearly. It was a Tuesday in October, and I'd gone to his office to surprise him with lunch. I'd spent the morning making his favorite sandwich, even buying that expensive mustard he liked. I was 46 then, still foolishly believing that small gestures could save a marriage that was already dying. When I walked into his office without knocking, I found them together. Not in the dramatic way you see in movies, but in a way that was somehow worse, intimate and casual, her hand on his shoulder as they looked at something on his computer screen, both of them laughing at some private joke. The way Carlton's face changed when he saw me told me everything I needed to know. The guilt was written across his features like a neon sign, followed quickly by irritation that I'd caught him. "Joelle," he'd said, his voice tight. "What are you doing here?" Not, "What a nice surprise," or "How thoughtful of you." Just annoyance that I'd interrupted his fun. Rebecca had the decency to look embarrassed, quickly gathering her papers and scurrying out of the office. But Carlton just sat there, staring at me with the kind of cold calculation I'd later learn to recognize as his default expression when he was figuring out how to spin a situation to his advantage. "It's not what you think," he'd said, the oldest lie in the book. But I knew what I'd seen. More importantly, I knew what I'd been feeling for months, the distance, the late nights, the way he looked through me rather than at me. That night, I did something I'd never done before in our 13 years of marriage. I went through his things, not just his pockets or his wallet, but everything. His desk, his computer, his bank statements. What I found changed everything. Carlton wasn't just unfaithful, he was reckless. Dangerously, catastrophically reckless with money. He'd been living far beyond our means for years, using credit cards to fund a lifestyle that looked successful from the outside, but was rotting from within. The expensive dinners, the designer clothes, the luxury car, all of it was purchased with borrowed money. Money we didn't have and couldn't afford to pay back. But the worst part was discovering that he'd been using our joint accounts to fund his affairs. The jewelry for Rebecca, the weekend getaways, even the fancy hotel rooms, all of it paid for with money that was supposed to be ours. That's when I made the decision that would define the next 18 years of my life. I wasn't going to leave Carlton. I was going to protect myself. The next morning I drove to the bank and opened my own account. Not a joint account, not something with Carlton's name on it. My own account, in my name only. Then I did something that surprised even me. I got a job. Carlton had always insisted I didn't need to work. "I make enough for both of us," he'd say whenever I brought up finding employment. "Your job is to take care of the house, to be here when I need you." I'd believed him for years, thought his old-fashioned attitude was actually protective rather than controlling. But after discovering his financial recklessness, I realized he didn't want me to work because he didn't want me to have my own money. Independent money. Escape money. The job I found was humble. Answering phones at a small accounting firm. The pay wasn't much, just $8 an hour, but it was mine. Carlton barely noticed when I told him about it, too absorbed in his own affairs to care what I did with my time. What he definitely didn't notice was how quickly I learned. Helen Morrison, the woman who owned the accounting firm, took me under her wing. She was in her 70s then, a sharp-minded woman who'd built her business from nothing after her husband died young. "Money is power, Joelle," she told me during my first week. "Not just the money itself, but understanding how it works, how to make it grow, how to protect it, how to hide it when you need to." She taught me about investments, about compound interest, about the little loopholes and strategies that the wealthy use to build and maintain their fortunes. More importantly, she taught me how to be patient, how to plan for the long term. Within 6 months, I'd been promoted to bookkeeper. Within a year, I was Helen's right-hand woman. And within 2 years, when Helen decided to retire, she offered to sell me the business. "I don't have that kind of money," I'd protested. Helen had smiled, that knowing smile of a woman who'd seen it all. "You'd be surprised what you can accomplish when you're motivated by necessity." She was right. I took out a small business loan, using our house as collateral, something I could do because my name was also on the deed. Carlton signed the papers without reading them, too busy with his latest secretary to pay attention to what I was doing. Meridian Holdings was born in 2010. On paper, it was just a small accounting firm that Helen Morrison had sold to her former employee. In reality, it became my lifeline. I worked during the day and studied at night, learning everything I could about investments and financial planning. I started small, putting aside $20 or $30 from each paycheck, investing it carefully, and watching it grow. Carlton never noticed the extra money because I never spent it. I lived exactly the same way I always had, frugally, carefully, making do with what we already owned. He saw what he expected to see, a dutiful wife who stayed within her budget and didn't ask for much. What he didn't see was that I was building my own fortune, one small investment at a time. The business grew slowly at first, then faster as word spread about my discretion and competence. Wealthy clients, particularly women in situations similar to mine, began seeking out my services. Women who needed to hide assets from controlling husbands, who wanted to protect their inheritances, who were planning for divorces they couldn't yet file. I became their secret keeper, their financial guardian angel. And in return, they taught me tricks I never would have learned in any textbook. By 2015, when Carlton met Mason, Meridian Holdings was managing just over $800,000 in assets. Money that existed in accounts Carlton didn't know about, invested in funds he'd never heard of, growing at rates that would have shocked him. But I kept living like the poor wife of a struggling businessman. I shopped at thrift stores, clipped coupons, drove my old car until it barely ran. Carlton saw exactly what I wanted him to see. A woman who was completely dependent on him, who couldn't possibly survive without his financial support. Mason's arrival should have devastated me, but by then I was beyond caring about Carlton's infidelities. I watched their relationship unfold with the detached interest of someone observing a car accident in slow motion. Carlton, now 60 years old, desperately trying to prove he was still virile and desirable. Mason, 32 and hungry, seeing dollar signs in his stories about business success. Neither of them realized that the money Carlton was spending on their relationship, the expensive dinners, the weekend trips, the jewelry, was coming from credit cards that were maxed to their limits. Carlton had been living on borrowed money for so long that he'd forgotten what actual wealth looked like. The gambling started sometime around 2020. Online poker at first, then sports betting, then day trading with money he didn't have. I watched our joint account balance plummet while Carlton chased bigger and bigger wins to cover his mounting losses. That's when I made my final decision. I quietly transferred all of my legitimate assets out of any account that had Carlton's name on it. The house, which had been paid off years ago with money from Meridian Holdings, was quietly restructured so that I owned 60% and Carlton owned 40%. A change he never noticed because I handled all the paperwork. By the time Carlton died, he owed approximately $350,000 to various creditors, credit card companies, online betting sites, a particularly unpleasant man named Eddie who handled private loans for desperate gamblers. The house that Mason thought she was inheriting? It was mortgaged to the hilt to cover Carlton's debts, the life insurance policy that named her as beneficiary. It had been cashed out months ago to pay Eddie, who'd been making increasingly specific threats about Carlton's kneecaps. The successful business that Carlton had bragged about to impress Mason? It hadn't turned a profit in 3 years, but none of them knew any of this. Not Mason, not Mr. Henderson, not even Carlton himself, who'd been so deep in denial that he actually believed his own lies about their financial situation. As I pulled into my driveway, the driveway of a house I actually owned, despite what everyone believed, I thought about the envelope I'd handed to Mr. Henderson. Inside were copies of documents that would shatter every assumption they'd made about me, about Carlton, about the inheritance they thought was coming. Tomorrow, when Macy showed up at the lawyer's office expecting to claim her prize, she was going to get the shock of her life. I sat in my car for a moment longer, looking at the modest 2-story house that had been my prison for so many years. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, I could finally stop pretending to be the helpless widow who needed rescuing. Tomorrow, Macy would learn that you should never underestimate a woman who's had 18 years to plan her revenge. But tonight, I allowed myself a small smile as I walked to my front door, keys jingling in the quiet evening air. The game was just beginning, and for the first time in 30 years, I was the one holding all the cards. I woke up the morning after the funeral feeling lighter than I had in years. For the first time in 3 decades, I didn't have to tiptoe around Carlton's moods, didn't have to pretend I didn't notice the smell of another woman's perfume on his clothes, didn't have to watch him lie to my face about where he'd been or what he'd been doing. The freedom was intoxicating. I made myself a proper breakfast, something I rarely did when Carlton was alive, since he preferred to eat out or have me prepare elaborate meals that showcased my domestic skills to his friends. Today, I scrambled eggs and made toast. Simple pleasures that tasted like liberation. My phone rang at exactly 9 o'clock. I knew who it would be before I answered. "Joelle, we need to talk." Mr. Henderson's voice was tight with barely controlled anxiety. "Can you come to my office this morning? There are some discrepancies in the documents you provided yesterday." I smiled, sipping my coffee slowly. Discrepancies? That's an interesting word for it. "This isn't a joke," he snapped, his professional composure cracking. "What you gave me yesterday, if it's authentic, it changes everything." "Oh, it's authentic," I assured him. "Would 10:30 work for you? I have some errands to run first." The errands were important. I needed to visit the bank, specifically to access a safety deposit box that Carlton had never known existed. The box contained documents that would complete the picture I'd started painting yesterday at the funeral home. First National Bank was a grand old building downtown, all marble columns and vaulted ceilings that echoed with the footsteps of serious people conducting serious business. I'd been coming here regularly for 13 years, always alone, always discreet. The safety deposit box was small, but packed with carefully organized files. Property deeds, investment statements, business and corporation papers, all the evidence of the parallel life I'd been building while Carlton thought I was just his dutiful, dependent wife. The most important document was at the bottom of the box, the original partnership agreement for Carlton's business. The business that Mason thought would be hers, the business that Mr. Henderson assumed was Carlton's sole property. What neither of them knew was that I owned 51% of Carlton's company. It had happened gradually, starting in 2012 when Carlton was going through one of his many financial crises. He'd come to me in tears, actual tears, begging for help. The business was failing, creditors were calling, and he was facing bankruptcy. "I need $20,000, he'd pleaded, "just to get through this rough patch. I'll pay you back, I swear." Of course, he didn't have $20,000 to pay me back. But I did, thanks to the careful investments I'd been making through Meridian Holdings. "I'll help you," I'd told him, "but not with a loan, as an investment." He'd been so desperate that he'd agreed to give me 20% of his business in exchange for the $20,000. It seemed like a bargain to him. 20% of something was better than 100% of nothing. But Carlton's financial troubles didn't end there. They never did. Every few months, there was another crisis, another emergency that required my intervention. And each time I negotiated for a larger share of the business. By 2018, I owned controlling interest in the company that bore Carlton's name. He'd signed the papers without reading them, too focused on solving his immediate problems to think about the long-term consequences. The beautiful irony was that Carlton's business only stayed afloat because of my money. The contracts he bragged about, the clients he claimed to have impressed, all of it was funded by investments from Meridian Holdings. Without me, his company would have collapsed years ago. But Mason didn't know any of this. Neither did Mr. Henderson. They saw what Carlton had wanted them to see: a successful businessman with a mousy wife who didn't contribute anything of value to their lifestyle. I locked the safety deposit box and headed to Henderson's office, the documents tucked safely in my briefcase. It was time for the second act of this little drama. Henderson's law office was exactly what you'd expect from a man who specialized in helping wealthy clients hide their assets and manipulate their families. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound books that were never opened, and an overwhelming smell of furniture polish and ambition. Mason was already there when I arrived, pacing back and forth in front of Henderson's desk like a caged animal. She'd dressed for the occasion in a sharp business suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized her angular cheekbones. "Finally," she said when I walked in. "Maybe now you can explain what kind of game you think you're playing." I set my briefcase down carefully and took a seat in one of Henderson's client chairs. They were expensive leather, the kind that was supposed to intimidate people into accepting whatever deal was being offered. "I'm not playing any games, Mason. I'm simply ensuring that everyone understands the actual facts about Carlton's estate." Henderson cleared his throat nervously. He was sweating despite the air conditioning, small beads of perspiration dotting his forehead. "Joelle, the documents you provided yesterday, they suggest that Carlton wasn't the sole owner of several key assets." "Suggest?" I opened my briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "There's no suggestion about it, Mr. Henderson. These are legal documents, all properly notarized and filed with the appropriate authorities." I spread the papers across his desk methodically, each one a nail in the coffin of their assumptions. Property deeds showing my name as primary owner. Business incorporation papers listing me as majority shareholder. Investment accounts that existed entirely separate from anything Carlton had access to. Mason snatched up one of the documents, her manicured nails clicking against the paper as she scanned it frantically. "This has to be fake. Carlton owned that business. He built it from nothing." "Actually," I said calmly, "Carlton built it from my money. Approximately $460,000 of my money, to be precise. Money that I invested in exchange for ownership shares." I pulled out another document, this one showing the payment history for Carlton's business loans. "Every major contract your boyfriend landed was funded by capital from Meridian Holdings. Every expansion, every new hire, every piece of equipment, all of it paid for with money from my company." Henderson was reading through the papers with growing horror. As Carlton's lawyer, he should have known about these arrangements, should have been aware that his client didn't actually own what he claimed to own. But Carlton had been lying to everyone, including his own attorney. "The house," Mason said desperately, grabbing another document. "He left me the house in his will. I saw it myself." "Yes," I agreed. "He left you his 40% share of the house. Unfortunately for you, I own the other 60%. And as the majority owner, I have certain rights regarding what happens to the property." The color drained from Mason's face as the implications sank in. "You can't just kick me out. I have legal rights as a beneficiary." "Actually, you don't." I turned to Henderson, who was looking more nauseated by the minute. "Perhaps you'd like to explain to Miss Mason what happens when someone inherits a minority share in a property they can't afford to maintain." Henderson loosened his tie, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. If Mrs. Joelle owns the majority share, and if the property taxes and maintenance costs exceed what the minority owner can afford, then the property can be sold to satisfy the debts," I finished for him, which brings us to another interesting point. I pulled out a thick stack of bills and legal notices that I'd been collecting for months. Carlton owed approximately $350,000 to various creditors at the time of his death. Credit cards, gambling debts, personal loans from some rather unsavory characters. Mason's eyes widened as she recognized some of the names on the collection notices. But Carlton said the business was doing well. He said we were rich. Carlton said a lot of things that weren't true, I replied. The reality is that he's been living on borrowed money for years. The expensive dinners, the weekend trips, the jewelry he bought you. All of it was paid for with credit cards that are now maxed out. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street below where normal people were going about their normal lives. The life insurance policy that names you as beneficiary? Carlton cashed it out 6 months ago to pay off a particularly persistent loan shark named Eddie who was threatening to break his legs. No, Mason whispered, sinking into a chair. That's not possible. Carlton showed me bank statements. He showed me proof that we had money. Forged statements, I said matter-of-factly. Carlton was very good at creating the illusion of wealth. He had to be, since he was living so far beyond his actual means. Henderson was frantically shuffling through papers, trying to find something that would contradict what I was telling them, but the documentation was ironclad. I'd spent years making sure of that. So, what does this mean? Mason asked, her voice small and defeated. I turned back to face her, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. It means that instead of inheriting a fortune, you're inheriting debt, substantial debt. The kind of debt that follows you around and ruins your credit rating. But surely there must be something, Henderson interjected desperately. Some asset that can be liquidated to satisfy the creditors. Oh, there is, I said with a smile that I didn't bother to make warm. Carlton's 40% share of the house will need to be sold to help pay his debts. Unfortunately, as the majority owner, I have first right of refusal on any sale. The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically hear the wheels turning in their heads as they tried to figure out how they'd been so completely outmaneuvered. You planned this, Mason said finally, her voice filled with a mixture of rage and grudging respect. You've been planning this for years. I've been protecting myself for years, I corrected. There's a difference. I gathered up my documents and placed them back in my briefcase. I'll give you both some time to process this information. Mason, you'll need to make arrangements to move out of the house within 30 days. As for Carlton's business debts, I'm sure you'll want to consult with your own attorney about your legal obligations as a beneficiary. I paused at the door, turning back one final time. Oh, and Mason, you might want to start looking for a job. A real job. The kind that comes with a steady paycheck and health insurance. As I walked out of Henderson's office, I could hear Mason starting to cry behind me. Not the delicate tears she'd shed at the funeral, but the ugly, desperate sobs of someone whose world was collapsing around them. I should have felt guilty. A better person probably would have felt guilty. Instead, I felt free. 3 days after my meeting with Henderson and Mason, I received a phone call that didn't surprise me. What surprised me was how long it took. You think you're so clever, don't you? Mason's voice was raw, stripped of its usual polish. Sitting there in your little house, playing your little games. But I know what you're really doing. I set down my cup of tea and settled more comfortably into my favorite chair. And what exactly am I doing, Mason? You're lying. About everything. Carlton told me about your so-called business. He said you answered phones for some old woman who felt sorry for you. There's no way you have the kind of money you're claiming to have. I see. I picked up a file from the stack on my coffee table, one of many I'd been organizing for this exact conversation. Tell me, did Carlton also tell you about his gambling problem? Silence on the other end of the line. Or about the $350,000 he owed to various creditors at the time of his death? Did he mention that part when he was promising you a life of luxury? You're making that up, Mason said, but her voice had lost its certainty. Am I? Why don't you drive over to the house? Well, what used to be your house, and check the mailbox. There should be several interesting pieces of correspondence waiting for you. The truth was, I'd been intercepting Carlton's mail for months, collecting evidence of his mounting debts while he remained blissfully unaware of how deep he'd dug his own grave. Bills from credit card companies, threatening letters from collection agencies, notices from his bookie. I'd kept it all, organizing it methodically while Carlton lived in his fantasy world where consequences didn't exist. "I don't have to listen to this," Maxine said, but she didn't hang up. "No, you don't. But you might want to, because I'm about to tell you something that even Carlton didn't know." I opened the file and pulled out a document that had taken me considerable effort to obtain. Did you know that Carlton's business partner in his early ventures was a man named Marcus Webb? Another silence. Marcus died in a car accident in 1998. Carlton told everyone that he bought out Marcus's share of the business with money he'd saved. What he actually did was forge Marcus's signature on several documents and steal his partner's half of the company. I could hear Mazine's breathing change on the other end of the line. "That's impossible. Carlton would absolutely do that," I interrupted. "Just like he forged bank statements to show you how wealthy you both were. Just like he took out loans in my name without my knowledge. Just like he spent money that didn't exist on a lifestyle he couldn't afford." The Marcus Webb situation had been Carlton's original sin, the one that set him on a path of increasingly desperate lies and schemes. I'd discovered it purely by accident 5 years ago when I was researching the history of Carlton's business for tax purposes. Marcus Webb's widow was still alive, living in a nursing home in Portland, completely unaware that her husband's business partner had systematically stolen everything that should have been her inheritance. I'd debated whether to tell her, ultimately deciding that some injustices were too old and too painful to resurrect. But I'd kept the evidence, just in case I ever needed it. "Why are you telling me this?" Mazine asked finally. "Because I want you to understand exactly who Carlton really was. Not the successful businessman he pretended to be, not the loving partner he played in public, but the desperate, lying, stealing man who destroyed everything he touched." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden I'd been cultivating for years. Carlton had always mocked my interest in gardening, calling it a waste of time and money. But gardens required patience, planning, and careful tending, qualities that had served me well in other areas of my life. "The apartment you've been living in," I continued, "the one Carlton said he bought for you, he didn't buy it. I did." This wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough. Carlton had used money from our joint account to pay the deposit and first few months' rent on Mason's apartment. But since I'd been funding our joint account with money from Meridian Holdings, technically every dollar Carlton spent came from my earnings. "That's impossible," Mason whispered. "The lease is in Carlton's name, but the payments all came from accounts that I controlled. When Carlton told you he was buying you expensive gifts, paying for your vacations, setting you up in a luxury apartment, he was spending my money. Money I earned through my business. Money I'd been carefully investing while he was busy playing the big shot." I pulled out another document, this one showing the payment history for Mason's rent. Every month for the past 8 years, the money had been automatically transferred from an account linked to Meridian Holdings. "I could have cut off those payments at any time," I said quietly. "I could have had you evicted months ago. The only reason I didn't was because I wanted to see how long Carlton's lies could sustain themselves." "But why?" Mazine's voice was barely audible now. "Why would you pay for the apartment where your husband was cheating on you?" It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself many times over the years. "Because knowledge is power, Mazine. As long as I knew where Carlton was spending his time and my money, I could control the situation. The moment I cut you off, you would have left him, and he would have found someone new to lie to. Someone I might not have been able to track as easily." The truth was more complicated than that, but Mazine didn't need to know about the private investigator I'd hired to document Carlton's affairs, or about the detailed records I'd kept of every lie he'd told. every promise he'd broken, every dollar he'd stolen from our marriage. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now you have a choice," I said, returning to my chair. "You can continue living in denial, pretending that Carlton was the man you thought he was, trying to claim an inheritance that doesn't exist. Or you can accept the reality of the situation and start planning for your future." What kind of future? There was desperation in her voice now, the sound of a woman who was finally beginning to understand how completely she'd been deceived. "Well, you're 40 years old, reasonably intelligent, and presumably capable of supporting yourself. You'll need to find a job, of course. A real job, not the kind of make-work position Carlton probably promised to create for you in his imaginary business empire." I flipped through the file again, finding the document I was looking for. "Speaking of which, you should know that Carlton's business officially declared bankruptcy yesterday. I filed the papers myself as the majority shareholder." "You can't do that." "Actually, I can, and I did. The business had no assets left to liquidate and approximately $200,000 in outstanding debts. The responsible thing to do was to shut it down before the creditors started coming after the shareholders personally. This was the final piece of Carlton's empire crumbling. His business had been bleeding money for years, kept alive only by regular infusions of capital from my accounts. With Carlton dead, and me no longer willing to prop up his illusions, bankruptcy was inevitable." "Those debts you mentioned," Mason said slowly, "the $350,000 Carlton owed. What happens to those?" "Excellent question. Since you were named as a beneficiary in Carlton's will, you're potentially liable for a portion of those debts. Specifically, any assets you inherited from Carlton could be seized by his creditors to satisfy their claims." I could practically hear the panic setting in. "But you said there weren't any real assets." "That's correct. Which means the creditors will likely pursue other avenues for collection. They might, for example, investigate whether Carlton transferred any assets to you before his death in an attempt to hide them from creditors. That expensive jewelry he bought you, the car he put in your name, the money he deposited into your personal accounts, all of that could be considered fraudulent transfers." This was the beautiful trap that Carlton had unknowingly set for Mason. In his eagerness to impress her and secure her loyalty, he'd used money he didn't have to buy her things that would now be reclaimed by his creditors. Every gift was evidence of his financial irresponsibility, every grand gesture proof that he'd been living beyond his means. "I didn't know," Mason said, her voice breaking. "I swear I didn't know any of this." "I believe you," I said, and surprisingly I did. Mason was greedy and selfish, but she wasn't particularly bright. Carlton had played her just as skillfully as he'd played everyone else, creating an elaborate fiction that she'd been all too willing to believe. "So, what do I do now?" she asked. I considered my answer carefully. This was the moment where I could choose to be magnanimous, to offer her some way out of the mess Carlton had created. But then I remembered the way she'd spit on my coat at the funeral, the vicious pleasure she'd taken in what she thought was my humiliation. "You should probably get a lawyer," I said finally. "A good one. And you should start looking for a place to live. The lease on your apartment expires at the end of this month, and I won't be renewing it." "Please," she whispered. "I'll do anything. I'll leave town. I'll never bother you again. Just, please don't do this." For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered all the years I'd spent in silence, watching my husband parade his mistresses around town while I played the role of the dutiful, oblivious wife. All the times I'd bitten my tongue while Carlton belittled me in front of his friends. All the nights I'd lain awake wondering if I'd ever be free of the prison my marriage had become. "I'm not doing anything to you, Mason," I said quietly. "Carlton did this. Every choice he made, every lie he told, every dollar he stole. That was all Carlton. I'm simply declining to continue cleaning up his messes." I hung up before she could respond. Outside my window, the garden was thriving in the late afternoon sunlight. I'd planted most of these flowers myself, choosing varieties that would bloom at different times throughout the year, so there would always be something beautiful to look at. Planning, patience, careful tending. In 2 days, I would be meeting with Daniel Morrison, my financial advisor, and the son of the woman who'd first taught me about money and power. We were going to discuss my plans for the property I really owned, the one Carlton had never known about, the one where I would finally be free to live exactly as I chose. But tonight, I was content to sit in my garden and watch the sunset, knowing that for the first time in 30 years, tomorrow belonged entirely to me. The eviction notice was delivered on a Tuesday morning, exactly 30 days after Carlton's funeral. I knew because I was the one who had instructed my lawyer to serve it. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Mason had made her choice, and now she would live with the consequences. I was having coffee in my kitchen when my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number, but I recognized Mason's voice immediately, though it was higher pitched than usual, strained with panic. "They're throwing me out!" she screamed into the phone. "The landlord says the lease is terminated and I have 24 hours to vacate the premises. You can't do this to me." I set down my coffee cup carefully. Actually, I can. The lease was month to month, and as the actual tenant of record, I have the right to terminate it with proper notice, which I gave you 30 days ago. But I have nowhere to go. That's unfortunate, but it's not my problem. I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the bird feeder I'd hung there years ago. A cardinal was perched on it, bright red against the gray morning sky. Beautiful things could exist even in the darkest times if you knew where to look for them. "You're a monster," Mason said, her voice breaking. "A heartless, vindictive monster." "No, Mason. I'm a woman who finally stopped paying for her husband's lies." I paused, considering whether to tell her the rest of it. In the end, I decided she deserved to know exactly how complete her downfall was going to be. "There's something else you should know," I said. "The collection agencies have been asking questions about you, specifically about the jewelry Carlton bought you and the car that's registered in your name." The silence on the other end was deafening. You see, when someone dies owing as much money as Carlton did, creditors become very interested in tracking down anything of value that might have been transferred before death. They call it a fraudulent conveyance, and it can be reversed by the courts. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear I didn't know Carlton was in debt." Unfortunately, ignorance isn't a defense in these matters. The law assumes that someone in a romantic relationship with the debtor should have been aware of their financial situation. This wasn't entirely true, but Mason didn't know enough about estate law to challenge me. "What does that mean?" "It means they're going to take everything. The Mercedes Carlton put in your name, they'll repossess it to satisfy his car loan, which he defaulted on 6 months ago. The jewelry, they'll seize it as fraudulent transfers. Even the furniture in your apartment could be considered marital property that should have gone to pay Carlton's debts." I could hear her crying now, soft, desperate sobs that should have made me feel guilty. Instead, I felt nothing but a cold satisfaction. This was what justice looked like after 30 years of humiliation and betrayal. "There's one more thing," I said quietly. "Carlton took out several credit cards in your name over the past 2 years. I have the documentation if you'd like to see it." This was the final nail in the coffin, the piece of Carlton's deception that would destroy any chance Mason had of walking away from this mess with her financial reputation intact. He'd used her social security number and forged her signature to open accounts that were now severely delinquent. "That's identity theft," she said, a spark of hope in her voice. "I can report it to the police." "You could try," I agreed, "but you'd need to prove that you never gave Carlton permission to use your information. Given that you were living together and he was paying all your bills, that might be difficult to establish. The credit card companies would argue that you knew about the accounts and benefited from them." This was a gray area legally, but I was counting on Mason's ignorance and desperation to prevent her from challenging it effectively. Besides, I continued, filing a police report would require you to admit that Carlton was defrauding you. That would undermine any claim you might have to assets from his estate. You can't simultaneously argue that you're entitled to inherit from him and that he was victimizing you. The trap was beautiful in its simplicity. Every move Carlton had made to impress Maxine, every gift he'd given her, every bill he'd paid on her behalf, had created evidence that could now be used against her. She was caught between acknowledging that she'd been defrauded, which would eliminate her inheritance claims, or maintaining that she'd been Carlton's legitimate partner, which would make her liable for his debts. Please, she begged, there has to be something, some way to work this out. I considered this for a long moment. In truth, I did have the power to help her. I could pay off Carlton's debts easily, could provide Maxine with enough money to start over somewhere else. But doing so would require me to care about her welfare, and I'd used up all my compassion during 30 years of marriage to a man who'd never deserved it. Actually, there might be one option, I said finally. What? I'll do anything. Carlton had a life insurance policy through his business. A small one, only $25,000, but it wasn't part of the estate because the premiums were paid by the company. This was true, though I was leaving out several important details. The beneficiary was listed as his spouse, which would be me, but I could potentially assign those benefits to someone else if I chose to. You would do that? Hope flooded her voice. For a price. The silence stretched between us, and I could practically hear her weighing her options. $25,000 wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. It might be enough for her to leave town, start over somewhere else, build a new life away from the wreckage of her relationship with Carlton. What kind of price? I want you to sign a document admitting that Carlton lied to you about his financial situation, that he promised you things he couldn't deliver, used money he didn't have to maintain your relationship, and left you with nothing but debts and false promises. Why? Because I want it on record. Want it? I want there to be no doubt about who Carlton really was and what kind of man I was married to for 30 years. This wasn't about the money, and we both knew it. This was about truth, about finally having someone else acknowledge the reality that I'd been living with for so long. For 3 decades, I'd been the only one who knew what Carlton was really like behind closed doors. Everyone else saw the charming businessman, the successful entrepreneur, the devoted partner. Only I knew about the lies, the debts, the endless schemes that always seemed to collapse just when he needed them most. If I sign this document, Maxine said slowly, you'll give me the insurance money? I'll give you $15,000, I corrected. The other $10,000 will go to pay the administrative costs of settling Carlton's estate. Another lie, but a small one. The truth was that I wanted to keep some of the money as a reminder of this conversation, of the moment when Carlton's final victim finally admitted that she'd been deceived. $15,000 isn't very much. No, I agreed. But it's more than Carlton left you, and it's certainly more than you deserve. The words hung in the air between us, harsh but honest. Mason had participated in the destruction of my marriage, had taken pleasure in what she thought was my humiliation, had spit on me at my husband's funeral. $15,000 wasn't compensation for her suffering. It was charity, and we both knew it. I need time to think about it. You have until 5 o'clock today. After that, the offer expires and you'll have to deal with Carlton's creditors on your own. I hung up before she could respond. The rest of the day passed quietly. I spent the morning organizing the files I'd accumulated over the years, all the evidence of Carlton's deceptions and financial irresponsibility. Some of it would go to my lawyer, some to the IRS, and some would simply be destroyed. I no longer needed to keep secrets about a dead man's failures. At 3:30, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see Maxine standing on my front porch. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. Her designer clothes were wrinkled, her perfect hair was unkempt, and her makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. "I'll sign your document," she said without preamble. "But I want to see the insurance policy first. I want proof that you actually have the money you're promising." I had to respect her caution. Even desperate, she wasn't completely naive. "Wait here," I said, leaving her standing on the porch while I retrieved the policy from my filing cabinet. When I returned, she read through it carefully, her lips moving silently as she processed the legal language. Finally, she looked up at me. "This is really all that's left? $25,000? It's all Carlton left that isn't tied up in debt or legal complications," I confirmed. "Everything else he owned was either mortgaged, borrowed against, or promised to creditors." She nodded slowly, defeat settling over her features like a mask. "Where do I sign?" I handed her the document I'd had my lawyer prepare. It was simple and straightforward, a sworn statement acknowledging that Carlton had misrepresented his financial situation and that she had been deceived about the inheritance she expected to receive. She read it through twice before signing, her hand trembling slightly as she wrote her name. When she finished, she looked up at me with something that might have been respect. "You really planned all this, didn't you? You knew exactly how it would end." "I planned to protect myself," I said. "Everything else was just Carlton being Carlton." I took the signed document and went back inside to get her check. $15,000, drawn on the account that contained what remained of Carlton's life insurance payout. "What will you do now?" I asked as I handed her the check. She stared at the numbers for a long moment before folding it carefully and putting it in her purse. "Leave town, I guess. Start over somewhere else. Try to forget this ever happened." "That's probably wise." She started to walk away, then turned back. "Can I ask you something?" I waited. "Did you ever love him? Carlton, I mean. Even a little bit?" The question caught me off guard. I'd been expecting anger, recriminations, perhaps even threats. I hadn't expected her to ask about love. "I thought I did," I said finally. "For a very long time, I thought I loved him. But looking back, I think what I actually loved was the idea of him. The man I thought he could become if he just tried hard enough." "And when did you stop?" I considered the question seriously. "I think it was the day I discovered you weren't his first affair. When I realized that betraying me wasn't a mistake he'd made, it was a pattern he'd chosen." Macy nodded as if she understood. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "I'm sorry. About the funeral, about the things I said. I thought I was winning something, but there was never really anything to win, was there?" "No," I agreed. "There wasn't." I watched her walk to the old Toyota she'd had to buy after the Mercedes was repossessed, watched her drive away down the street where I'd lived for 30 years as Carlton's wife. Tomorrow I would start packing for my move to the house I'd kept secret all these years. But tonight, I was finally free to grieve not for the man Carlton had been, but for the man I'd once believed he could be. Some endings, I realized, were really beginnings in disguise. 6 months after Carlton's funeral, I stood in the master bedroom of a house that no one from my old life had ever seen. Sunlight streamed through windows that I'd chosen myself, illuminating hardwood floors that I'd walked across every morning for the past 13 years during my secret visits. This was my real home, the one I'd bought piece by piece with money from Meridian Holdings, the sanctuary I'd been preparing for the day when I would finally be free to live as myself rather than as Carlton's wife. The house sat on 3 acres of carefully landscaped property 30 miles outside the city, far enough away to ensure privacy, but close enough that I could still manage my business. It was nothing ostentatious, a comfortable 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch and a garden that I'd been cultivating for over a decade. But it was mine, completely and utterly mine, in a way that the house I'd shared with Carlton had never been. I'd bought it gradually, starting with the land in 2011 and adding improvements year by year. The official owner of record was Meridian Holdings, which meant that Carlton had never known it existed. To him, It was just another business investment that his financially naive wife didn't understand. The irony was exquisite. While Carlton was spending our joint account money on his affairs and his gambling, I was using my own earnings to build the life I would lead after he was gone. Every dollar he wasted was a dollar I didn't have to spend on his deceptions. Moving in had been surprisingly simple. Most of my important belongings had already been here for years, stored in the rooms Carlton never knew existed. My books, my mother's jewelry, the photographs that meant something to me, all of it had been waiting patiently for the day when I could live openly in my own space. The house Carlton thought I would be forced to sell was now occupied by a nice young couple with 2 small children. I'd sold it to them for exactly what I'd paid for it 25 years ago, ignoring my realtor's protests that I could get much more in the current market. Money isn't everything, I'd told him, and meant it. The truth was, I wanted that house to be filled with happiness for once. I wanted children's laughter to echo through rooms that had been silent for too long. Wanted love to flourish in spaces that had been poisoned by Carlton's lies. Selling it below market value was my gift to the family who would make it a real home. This morning, I was expecting a visitor. Margaret Chen had been my friend for 15 years, one of the few people who'd seen through Carlton's facade and understood what my marriage had really been like. She was also one of the handful of people who'd known about this house and my plans for it. Margaret arrived at 10 o'clock sharp, carrying a bottle of champagne and a genuine smile. At 72, she was still elegant and sharp-minded, the kind of woman who'd built her own successful career in real estate while managing to stay happily married to the same man for 50 years. "So this is where you've been hiding," she said, looking around the sun-filled living room with obvious approval. "It's beautiful, Joelle. Absolutely beautiful." We settled into comfortable chairs by the window, looking out over the garden where daffodils were just beginning to bloom. Margaret had helped me plan some of these flower beds, offering advice during my weekend visits when I was supposed to be running errands for Carlton. "How does it feel?" she asked, pouring champagne into the crystal glasses I'd set out. "Quiet," I said, and she understood immediately. For 30 years, I'd lived with the constant low-level stress of managing Carlton's moods, his lies, his financial crises. Even when he wasn't actively creating drama, there had always been the anxiety of waiting for the next explosion. Now, for the first time since I was 34 years old, my days belonged entirely to me. "Have you heard anything about Macy?" Margaret asked. "She left town about 3 months ago. Someone told me she's working as a receptionist in Tucson now, living in a studio apartment, driving a car that's older than she is." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Do you feel sorry for her?" I considered the question seriously. I feel sorry for the woman she could have been if she'd never met Carlton. But the woman she chose to become? No. She made her decisions with her eyes wide open. The settlement of Carlton's estate had taken 4 months to complete. In the end, there had been just enough assets to pay his creditors and cover the legal fees. The house sale, the liquidation of his business equipment, the small insurance policy, all of it went to satisfy the debts he'd accumulated during his final years of self-destruction. Macy had walked away with the $15,000 I'd given her and nothing else. No jewelry, no car, no future financial support from a man she'd thought was wealthy. Just the hard lesson that when you build your life around someone else's lies, you're bound to get buried under them. "I've been thinking," Margaret said, settling back in her chair. "What you did wasn't really revenge, was it?" "What do you mean?" "Revenge would have been active, deliberately hurting them, going out of your way to cause pain." She gestured around the beautiful room where we were sitting. "What you did was just stop participating in their deception." She was right. I hadn't plotted Carlton's downfall or engineered Mason's humiliation. I'd simply stopped enabling their fantasy, stopped using my money to prop up Carlton's illusions of success, stopped pretending to be the helpless victim they needed me to be. The consequences had been inevitable once I stepped out of my role as their unwitting sponsor. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing, Margaret continued. Just step back and let people face the natural results of their choices. My phone buzzed with a text message. Daniel Morrison, my financial advisor, confirming our meeting next week to discuss expanding Meridian Holdings. The business had grown significantly since I'd stopped diverting funds to cover Carlton's expenses, and we were exploring opportunities to help other women in situations similar to what mine had been. Not a charity. I wasn't interested in being anyone's savior, but a business that specialized in helping women protect their assets and build independent financial security. There was a market for that kind of discretion, especially among clients who needed to plan for uncertain futures. What's next for you? Margaret asked, noticing my smile as I read the message. Work, mostly. I have more energy for it now that I'm not constantly managing someone else's crises. I looked around the room that had been waiting for me for so many years. And this house needs some updating. I was thinking about putting in a studio space for painting. This was something I'd never told Carlton about. The art classes I'd been taking for the past 5 years, the canvases that were stored in the upstairs bedroom, the secret creative life I'd been cultivating alongside my business success. You paint? I'm learning to. Badly, but enthusiastically. I laughed, remembering my first attempts at landscape painting. Turns out I have a lot to say about beauty and patience and things growing in their own time. We spent the afternoon walking through the house and garden, Margaret admiring the careful thought that had gone into every room, every flower bed, every practical detail. This wasn't a house that had been decorated for show. It was a space designed for actual living, for comfort and solitude, and the quiet pleasures of a life lived on one's own terms. As the sun began to set, we returned to the living room where Margaret gathered up her purse and the empty champagne bottle. You know, she said, pausing at the front door, I never liked Carlton. I know I never said it outright, but I thought you should know. I know, I said. You were too polite to say so, but it was obvious. What I don't understand is why you stayed so long. You had the money to leave years ago. You had this house, your business, complete financial independence. Why did you wait until he died? It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself lately. I think I needed to know that I could survive the worst he could do to me. That even if he took everything, even if he left me publicly humiliated and apparently destitute, I would still be okay. I looked back at the house that represented my true life, the one I'd been building in secret while everyone thought I was just Carlton's long-suffering wife. Leaving would have been admitting defeat. Staying meant I got to choose the ending. Margaret hugged me goodbye, and I stood on the porch watching her car disappear down the tree-lined driveway. The evening was warm for early spring, and I could hear birds settling into their nests, preparing for the night. I thought about Carlton, probably for the last time with any real emotion. He'd spent his life trying to be someone he wasn't, using other people's money and trust to maintain an illusion that ultimately destroyed him. In the end, his lies had been bigger than his ability to sustain them, and the whole elaborate structure had collapsed under its own weight. I thought about Mazine, starting over in a new city with nothing but the hard-earned knowledge that fairy tales don't exist, and Prince Charming sometimes turns out to be a middle-aged con man with a gambling problem and a talent for making other people pay for his mistakes. And I thought about myself, 64 years old and finally free to live without lies, without pretense, without the exhausting effort of propping up someone else's ego while diminishing my own. The garden stretched out before me in the gathering twilight, full of plants I'd chosen and nurtured and watched grow year after year. Tomorrow, I would start painting again, working on the landscape series I'd been planning for months. Next week, I would meet with Daniel about expanding my business into new markets. Next month, I would take the European vacation I'd been postponing for 15 years. But tonight, I was content to sit on my own porch, in my own house, surrounded by my own choices and the profound peace that comes from finally living as yourself. Some victories are loud and dramatic, celebrated with crowds and champagne toasts. Others are quiet and private, marked only by the absence of things that once caused pain. As I sat there in the growing darkness, listening to the night sounds of a place that was finally and completely home, I realized that quiet victories might be the sweetest ones of all. The soft evening breeze carried the scent of jasmine from the garden I'd planted with my own hands, in the soil of the life I'd built for myself, in the sanctuary where Carlton's lies could never reach me again. I was 64 years old, and I was just beginning. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.